Hey everyone, today we're taking a look at how people in ancient Greece used to live. Not just kings and battles, but real everyday life. And honestly, it's way more interesting than you might think. If you visited the home of a Greek prince back then, the first thing you'd see was a big, tall stone wall with a strong wooden door. Once you opened the door, you'd walk into a large open space called a courtyard. A huge dog might bark and run over to check if you were welcome. But in really rich homes, instead of a real dog, there might be a gold or silver statue of one, just to show off. By the entrance, there were stone benches where people could sit and talk. As you walked farther in, you'd find stables for horses and oxen, and places for animals like pigs, sheep, and geese. If the house was really fancy, it even had gardens with fruit trees like apples, pears, figs, and olives. These houses were built like little forts, with fountains for water, plenty of food, and animals, so they could survive if enemies attacked. Inside the house, there were many rooms, tall columns, and even an upstairs area where they kept their treasures. Back then, Greeks didn't use money. They measured wealth by how many oxen you had. For example, a slave might be worth between 4 and 20 oxen. But they did have gold and silver objects like cups, bowls, and vases, many of them shaped beautifully. Even plain clay pots were decorated with scenes from stories or nature. In the treasure room, there were big wooden boxes covered in gold, silver, and ivory. Inside were fancy clothes, carpets, soft sheets, and covers for beds and benches. They also had jewelry, like necklaces and bracelets, and weapons too. Swords, bows, spears, and arrows made of bronze or copper were ready to protect the home if needed. Even though they had slaves, some taken in war or kidnapped, the rich weren't afraid to do work themselves. The famous Greek king Odysseus even built his own bed. And there's a fun story about a princess named Nausicaa. She went with her friends to the river to do laundry, brought a basket of food, and played ball afterward, just like regular girls would. Speaking of food, we don't know exactly what was in that picnic basket, but it was probably full of tasty treats. At big dinners though, the food was really simple, mostly bread and meat. Greeks didn't go to parties just to eat a lot. They enjoyed talking with each other more than stuffing themselves. At a banquet, the room would be full of guests. Each person got their own small table and a chair. Servants brought out bowls of water so everyone could wash their hands. Then came big chunks of meat, which were cut into small pieces, because they didn't have forks, just fingers. Bread was passed around too. For drinks, they had wine, but it was always mixed with lots of water, usually 3 parts water to 1 part wine. The oldest guest always got served first, even if he wasn't rich or important. Drinking too much was considered embarrassing, and being called a drunk was a big insult. There was always a bard at these gatherings, a person who told stories and sang songs. Even if life was tough for them, they were treated with respect. One famous bard, who was blind, had a special chair, his own table with wine, and his instrument, the lyre, hanging nearby so he could play for the guests. Greeks were super serious about hospitality. If someone showed up hungry, you had to feed them, even if they were a stranger. You didn't even ask their name until after they'd eaten. And if someone came in peace, even an enemy, they were given food and a safe place to stay. Hurting them was not allowed. And back in ancient Greece, kids didn't go to school like today. There were no classrooms or textbooks. Instead, they learned by copying what their parents did every day. Girls stayed with their mothers and learned how to manage the home. They were taught how to cook, clean, take care of chores, and tell workers what to do. They also had to learn how to spin thread, weave cloth, and perform songs and dances, all by watching and practicing, not by taking lessons. Boys had a different role. They learned how to take care of animals like goats and sheep, grow crops, and protect the land. They also practiced using weapons to prepare for battle. Like the girls, boys learned by doing things hands-on, not from books. Back then, reading and writing weren't very important. There wasn't much to read or write, so most people didn't bother. Math was simple. They only needed to count animals or supplies. History was passed down through myths and stories that were easy to remember. kind of like fairy tales. And their idea of geography? They thought the earth was flat and surrounded by a giant river called ocean. Beyond that was only darkness and strange monsters. Even though life was full of chores, kids still found time to play. One popular game was 5 Pebbles, where kids tossed 5 small stones and tried to catch them on the back of their hand. If some fell, they could pick them up, but they had to keep the others balanced. The Greeks enjoyed their lives a lot. They believed people kept living after death, but not in a fun way. Only the bravest heroes got to go to a happy place called the Elysian Fields, where the weather was always perfect, and they could keep doing what they loved. Regular people expected to end up in Hades, a dark, shadowy place where nothing felt real and there was no joy. Because the afterlife didn't sound exciting, the Greeks focused on living life to the fullest. They believed the gods had the power to help them get what they wanted, as long as the fates didn't get in the way. So they didn't worship the gods because they were kind. They did it because they were powerful. Parents didn't say, "Be good like Zeus." They said, "Pray to Zeus so he'll help you." Each god had a special job. One could help with safe travel, another could heal sickness, and another could help win battles. People gave gifts to the gods they thought could help with whatever problem they were facing. They also believed that in the past, gods walked among humans. But now they looked for signs, like a storm meaning Zeus was angry, or lightning showing he was pleased. Birds flying high in the sky were also thought to carry the gods' messages. When signs weren't clear, people went to oracles, sacred places where they believed gods gave answers through priests or priestesses. One of the oldest oracles was for Zeus at Dodona. There, priests listened to the sounds of doves and wind in the trees to figure out the gods' messages. People came with gifts and asked all kinds of questions, even simple ones like whether someone had stolen their lost pillows. The most famous oracle was Apollo's at Delphi. It sat on a mountain where gas came out of a crack in the ground. A priestess would sit above it, breathe in the fumes, and speak strange words. The priests would then explain what she said. Their answers were often tricky, so no matter what happened, they could say they were right. For example, when King Croesus asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle said, "You will destroy a great empire." He thought it meant he'd win, but it turned out he destroyed his own empire. Even the famous philosopher Socrates asked the oracle a question. The answer was that no one was wiser than him. Socrates said that made sense because he knew how little he truly understood, while others wrongly thought they knew everything. Temples were built at oracle sites, and people brought so many gifts that the temples became very rich. The temple at Delphi became especially powerful, and nearby tribes formed a group to protect it. This group was called an Amphictyony. They made sure the roads to the temple were safe and punished anyone who tried to harm it. Although the tribes often fought among themselves, they agreed to follow certain rules during war. They promised not to destroy each other's towns or block access to water. This was a big step forward, since wars in ancient times were usually brutal. These temple alliances made the Greeks feel more united. They spoke the same language, told the same stories, and started to see themselves as part of one big family. One thing that brought all Greeks together was sports. Only Greeks could compete in special athletic events held to honor the gods. Even during Homer's time, people believed the gods enjoyed watching these contests. So at every big festival for a god, races and sports were just as important as prayers. 4 of these festivals became well known, and the one held in Olympia for Zeus was the most famous. Over time, the number of events grew, but the foot race was always the main event. In 776 BCE, they started keeping records of the winners. That year is seen as the start of real, recorded history in Greece.